Welcome to the 30 Years' War, the George W. Bush years of the new Cold War. I will be presenting a framework that describes and explains the actual aims of these wars, and I will be particularly interested in how well you think this framework does or does not account for the evidence. Here's one proposed framework, a message from God, which works well if we accept the assumption that God works in mysterious ways. Here are two more proposed frameworks, humanitarian intervention and democracy promotion. Dar Jamel describes a study on the effects of depleted uranium munitions.
Statistics and found that the amount of congenital malformations in Fallujah is 14 times greater than the same rate measured in the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in the aftermath of the nuclear bombing.
And I talked about my desire to promote institutional change in parts of the world, like Iraq, where there's a free press and free religion, and I told him that a lot of people in our country, would hope that Russia would do the same thing. I fully understand, however, that there will be a Russian-style democracy.
We certainly would not want to have the same kind of democracy as they have in Iraq, I will tell you quite honestly.
Just wait.
These also account well for the evidence if we accept that George Bush works in mysterious ways. However, then we are still left with a mystery. Here is a framework of more worldly war aims. Realism. That is the pursuit by nations for wealth and power, with the goal of regional and global hegemony. Can you think of any realist doctrines in U.S. foreign policy? Do any of these look familiar? Can George Bush's wars and Canadian participation in them fit within these U.S. realist doctrines? What do you think? Could any of these have influenced the Bush war aims? Before we look for realist doctrines involved in the Afghanistan war, let's look at the three most important things every realist war planner and every real estate salesman considers. Location, location, location. Starting at the top in the former Soviet republics, the Caspian Sea basin held promising natural gas fields. Looking counterclockwise, in 2 years Iraq would be invaded, bracketing Iran. As people in the Bush administration were fond of saying, anyone can go to Baghdad, real men go to Tehran. Pakistan, a potential path for Persian Gulf pipelines to India and China. And Xinjiang, China, connected to Afghanistan by a narrow corridor you can see in the upper right. Can you name 3 U.S. realist doctrines that may have influenced the aims of the Afghanistan war? And for bonus marks, tell why. Truman Doctrine, containment of Russia and China. Look closely at this map. Afghanistan is in the contested Rimland. Carter Doctrine, U.S. control of the Persian Gulf. Afghanistan is not on the Persian Gulf, but the war with Iraq was only 2 years away, squeezing Iran between U.S.-occupied territory. Mahan, choke points. How so choke points for landlocked Afghanistan? Well, 80% of Chinese oil flows through the Malacca Straits. A pipeline through Afghanistan from the Persian Gulf or the Caspian Basin would remove that choke point. Here's what former Chief of Staff to the U.S. Secretary of State during the Bush Wars said about Afghanistan war aims.
It's about China, Russia, the soft underbelly, which is mostly Muslim of Russia, a general. And the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, I'll predict right now, will not go away for another half century.
Oh my God, that's a horrible thought.
And it will grow. It will not decrease, it will grow.
The 2003 Iraq War was billed as an imminent national security threat, with Saddam Hussein's links to al-Qaeda and weapons of mass destruction that could be deployed within 45 minutes. However, did the war have an earlier genesis? Say a few weeks after 9/11 in 2001.
And one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do."
Or perhaps earlier in that spring when Vice President Cheney produced this map for a meeting with oil executives to discuss Iraq's oil reserves. Or perhaps a decade earlier in 1991 after that Iraq war.
I think I'll see Wolfowitz. So I called, and up there he was available. Scooter Libby came to the door. I met Scooter for the first time, and he brought me in. And I said to Paul, I said, and this is 1991, I said, "Mr. Secretary, you must be pretty happy with the performance of the troops in Desert Storm." And he said, "Well, yeah," he said, but not really. He said, "Because the truth is we should have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, and we didn't." And this was just after the Shia uprising in March of 91, which we had provoked, and then we kept our troops on the sidelines and didn't intervene. And he said, "But one thing we did learn," he said, "we learned that we can use our military in the region, in the Middle East, and the Soviets won't stop us." He said, "And we've got about 5 or 10 years to clean up those old Soviet client regimes, Syria, Iran, Iraq, before the next great superpower comes on to challenge us." And it was like, you know, I'm coming out of the Mojave Desert. I'm been training troops. I haven't been thinking geostrategy for some time. And suddenly a guy just sort of shoves this nugget at you. Well, you remember it. It was a pretty stunning thing. You mean the purpose of the military is to start wars and change governments? It's not to sort of deter conflict?
Now let's pause a moment to mention something we will discuss in more detail later. Both George H.W. Bush and Clinton had also attacked Iraq, but not invaded it. How realism is practiced is influenced by the self-interests of the elite.
These people took control of the policy in the United States.
What is the name given to these people? Neoconservatives, a group that had promoted very hawkish policies for decades, including the invasion of Iraq in their 1998 Project for a New American Century. Now back to U.S. realist policies. Can you name 3 realist doctrines that may have influenced the Iraq war aims? Truman Doctrine, containment of Russia and China. Carter Doctrine, U.S. control of the Persian Gulf. Mahan choke points, the Strait of Hormuz. And one more that would be on any neoconservative agenda, neoliberalism. It is often stated that the Iraqi constitution, written by the Coalition Provisional Authority, was a neoliberal, to use the more polite term, nocturnal emission. Well now, if we could apply all 5 doctrines, would you agree there was no need to invoke divine inspiration, humanitarian intervention, or democracy promotion? So, how about the Monroe Doctrine? In Iraq? Well, why did Canada send Army, Navy, and Air Force personnel to support Operation Iraqi Freedom when the war was so unpopular with voters that the government kept it a secret? Answer: it wouldn't do for Canada to offend the regional hegemon, and besides, if they did, they would not have a place at the table for any scraps. The UK parliamentary inquiry into the Iraq War discovered that Her Majesty's government and British oil corporations wanted a place at that table and were expecting more than scraps. They wanted to feast on the Total and Russian contracts signed with Iraq to develop superfields after the sanctions were lifted. The Venezuelan coup replaced President Hugo Chavez with the president of the Chamber of Commerce.
Constituir un gobierno de transición democrática y unidad nacional de la siguiente forma y bajo los siguientes lineamientos. Se suspende de sus cargos a los diputados principales y suplentes a la Asamblea Nacional. Se destituyen de sus cargos al presidente y demás magistrados del Tribunal Supremo de Justicia, así como al fiscal general de la República, al Contralor General de la República, al Defensor del Pueblo y a los miembros del Consejo Nacional Electoral.
Producto de este amplio mandato que recibiéramos del bravo pueblo venezolano, que constituyó más que un referéndum, asumimos pues.
What three countries do you think collaborated to kidnap President Aristide of Haiti and took him to the French-dominated Central African Republic? They are named here.
This is a clear case and a shameful case where Canada, the United States, and France joined together instead of furthering democracy, ended democracy.
A good example of the contingency of alliances is that France would not participate in the Iraq War, which was harmful to their interests, but a year later they were convinced to participate in the Haitian coup with the promise that the new government would renounce Aristide's claim for $21 billion of recompense for the amount plus interest that France had extorted from Haiti in the 19th century. We can generalize Lord Palmerston's famous quip about Britain to all nations. We have no eternal allies and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual. For the Venezuelan and Haitian coups, name three applicable doctrines and explain why. The Monroe Doctrine, the need to replace independent rulers like Chavez and Aristide with supplicants. Mahan, controlling the windward passage that lies between Guantanamo Bay and Haiti. And of course, neoliberalism. Both Chavez and Aristide were implementing redistributive policies, with Chavez openly socialist and anti-American. In this video clip, setting aside Chavez's normative perspective, how accurate do you think his historical perspective is on U.S. foreign policy?
And the devil came here yesterday. Yesterday, the devil came here. Right here. Right here. And it smells of sulfur still today. This table that I am now standing in front of. Yesterday, ladies and gentlemen, from this rostrum, the President of the United States, the gentleman to whom I refer as the devil, came here talking as if he owned the world. Truly, as the owner of the world. I think we could call a psychiatrist to analyze yesterday's statement made by the President of the United States. As the spokesman of imperialism, he came to share his nostrums to try to preserve the current pattern of domination, exploitation, and pillage of the peoples of the world. An Alfred Hitchcock movie could use it as a scenario. I would even propose a title, The Devil's Recipe. As Chomsky says here clearly and in depth, the American empire is doing all it can to consolidate its hegemonistic system of domination, and we cannot allow them.
For your answer, consider these points. Was Chavez historically accurate to say the U.S. follows realist logic, aspires to dominate the Americas, aspires to dominate the world, for power and wealth, including pillage? Would all countries do so if they could? Were George W. Bush's wars effective policy? Normatively, can realism be good or bad policy? Is there an alternative to realism? After this discussion, we'll have a closer look at the details of each of these wars.